My name is Albert Yoon, and I'm a law professor here at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. This webinar is hosted by the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, a vibrant intellectual community that is home to a diverse range of ideas and approaches. The faculty's stature as one of the very best law schools in the world rests on the excellence and diversity of our faculty, robust clinics and centers, and the caliber of our students. Today, Professor of Law, Political Science, and Global Affairs, Ayelet Shachar, will address a topic covered in her latest book, The Shifting Border, Legal Cartographies of Migration and Mobility, published by the Manchester University Press. Published just weeks before COVID-19, the pandemic took hold in North America. Her book critically examines the role of territory and new measures of managed migration control in selectively restricting, or conversely, accelerating mobility and access. Professor Shachar is also the author of the award-winning Multicultural Jurisdictions, Cultural Differences, and Women's Rights and Birthright Lottery, Citizenship, and Global Inequality. She has published extensively in leading law reviews, social science journals, and political philosophy journals, and is the lead editor of the field-defining Oxford Handbook of Citizenship. In addition to all of these publications, Professor Shachar has received Research Excellence Awards nationally as well as internationally. She is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and in 2015, she became director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. More recently, she was awarded the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize, Germany's most prestigious research award, for her groundbreaking work on citizenship and the legal frameworks of accommodation in multicultural societies. Before Professor Shachar begins, just one quick note-keeping detail. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. At 12:45, Raquel from the Advancement Office will ask the questions for Professor Shachar to answer. And with that, I welcome you to today's podcast. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Albert, for this generous introduction. And thank you all for tuning in. I understand that there are a few students in the audience, and especially some members of the new incoming class of 2023. So welcome, lovely to have you. I wish I could meet you in person, but this is the best we can do under the circumstances. So I hope once you settle into law school and in your upper year classes, you're welcome to come and meet me and to discuss some of the issues that we will explore today. Last but not least, I want to thank our alumni office, especially Raquel, for all the work that she has done in terms of making this event happen and bringing us together virtually until we are able to be back in our beautiful law school building. My talk today, as you see in the title, is based on my new book, The Shifting Border, Legal Cartographies of Migration and Mobility. And as you just heard, my book was literally published just days before COVID-19 took hold in North America. And I'll get back to COVID later on. But in terms of what I want to do in the short time that we have together, I want to take you with me on a journey that will explore how the basic tools of public law, legislation, regulation, and case law have become central tools in reinventing key dimensions of sovereignty in the modern era. Specifically, I will talk to you about border control and how states are trying to reimagine territoriality in this new era that I will describe to you. So let us begin. If I asked you to close your eyes and imagine a border, what image would come to mind? I think that most of us would think of the border as a line on a map. Or you might think about it as a physical barrier, a barrier that's physically firmly attached or placed at the edge of the territory. And this particular image is so deeply familiar to us that I'll just give you two examples which really illustrate this image of the border. So if you think of the Great Wall of China, for example, that's a classic example of a fixed, massive barrier that has long served as a powerful symbol of sovereign control and sovereign authority. So that's one classic example. Another example that I want to share with you is the Berlin Wall. For those of you who remember, not everyone in the room, probably not members of the class of 2023, but that wall, the Berlin Wall, was not only fortified, it was visible. It ran as a scar in the middle of a deeply divided city. And not only that, it was also a violent border, violent in the sense that anyone who came within its vicinity without permission would literally the guards that were protecting the border were ordered to shoot anyone who came near that border. So these are two dramatic examples of the kind of old traditional border. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, there was a sense, and if you go back to the literature at the time, it's actually quite striking to read it now, in hindsight with the 30 years that we have had since. But at the time, many scholars, many distinguished scholars, had predicted that closed borders, that states themselves would become relics of a bygone era. And of course, today, we know that a very different reality has emerged. So those predictions of a borderless world have not materialized. Instead, what we are witnessing the world over is border walls, which are being built in unprecedented pace. And this is true throughout the world. If you want to think of a concrete example, probably most of you are familiar with the most politicized border, which is the US-Mexico border wall. So this is the familiar image that we have. At the same time, and this is what I want to share with you today, a new and really quite striking trend has emerged. And this I will refer to as the rise of sophisticated, invisible borders that instead of brick and mortar, instead of steel and barbed wire, rely instead on shrewd legal techniques to create a whole new conception of the border, the shifting border. And that is the topic of my book. And of course, I'll only share with you a small part actually of that discussion, but hopefully entice your interest in it and some of the ideas that I explore in it in full. And of course, you're welcome to read the book itself. The shifting border, unlike the traditional static fortified border, is not fixed in time and place. And the fact that it is not fixed in time and place, the fact that this border is in flux, that the border is mobile, means that the bordering functions that come with the border can be detached from a fixed territorial marker. So at least in theory in the world today, migration control can take place anywhere in the world without any of the prior restrictions from the perspective of states of being rooted in a particular territorial marker. And as I show in the book, one of the most remarkable developments of recent years is the fact that the border itself has become a moving barrier, an unmoored legal construct. So the kind of, when I asked you to imagine the border, the kind of fixed black lines that we would expect as you would still actually see in a world atlas are no longer descriptive. They no longer coincide with the rise of these remote control migration functions that may potentially, as I mentioned, take place anywhere in the world. And I will provide you several concrete examples that I use in the book momentarily. I just first want to share with you the framework of analysis that I use in the book. And as I explain, and again, I'll just flag this now, you're welcome to ask me during the Q&A, what these developments, these significant developments do is they really challenge our basic assumptions. Our basic assumptions, the ones that we still have with us from 1989, post-1989, the notion of waning sovereignty, the idea of demise of states. Clearly the shifting border challenges that because it's a very powerful exercise of authority, just not in the traditional way that it was done in the past. And I also want to suggest that it really tells us shows us the significant limits of the kind of populist nationalist discussion that we have in many countries, which pushes further refortification of borders. So the kind of border wall discussion that you would have in the United States also is politically and symbolically very meaningful, but legally it's not really the technique that states now use to regulate mobility. And as I will illustrate, as I mentioned, with a few comparative examples, what is unique about the shifting border is the fact that it is a legal construct. That is, we're seeing legal portals rather than the traditional way of doing the border, that is fences, walls, gates, etc. And the point that I wish to emphasize is that the location of the border is shifting. And the fact that the location of the border is shifting tremendously expands the possibility of states to regulate and control and screen individuals prior to arrival, throughout their journey, and in some cases also after they have reached the territory. People are still monitored as if they are crossing the border, which is a long way to say that both the locus and the focus of migration control has shifted. And given that this new border relies on law's admission gates, it can contract inward, that is, it can apply within the interior, within the territory. It may extend dramatically outwards. And again, the examples that I will show you will illustrate both of these movements inside and outside. But also this border, because it is so flexible, because it can be changed with the stroke of a pen, it may appear, it may reappear, it may disappear. So really the notion that we have of that old traditional kind of Berlin Wall or the Wall of China is just no longer synonymous with the reality, the legal reality that we find out there. And of course, this matters significantly because with this expanded power, there are dramatic implications for the scope of rights and protections that any individuals who's affected by the shifting border, but specifically vulnerable migrants, asylum seekers, other non-citizens may enjoy in practice. So this is a significant point that I want us to keep in mind. And one last point that I will mention before I turn to the example is the following. And this is really related to COVID, but these trends have actually started prior to that. I believe they will accelerate thereafter. So in the past, this new technique of bordering, that is the flexible, stretchable tentacles of the shifting border, were used primarily to monitor people on the move. And by people on the move here, I'm referring specifically to individuals who escaped poverty, who escaped persecution, who escaped countries where they faced tremendous instability. So this is partly what we have seen, definitely with the European developments post-2015 after the refugee crisis, the storm of migration, whichever title you want to give it. That has been the kind of development that we have seen. What's distinctive today at the moment that we're now experiencing is that everyone, and this really is everyone, potentially every one of us, that is including citizens of well-off societies, democratic countries such as Canada, is potentially now subject to the ever-expanding reach of the shifting border. And this is significant. And the responses to the global pandemic have definitely accelerated this trend. And to some extent, they are still being shaped. And this is a significant moment for us to have this discussion because partly the concern is that some changes that will now take effect under these very unusual circumstances that we're facing will remain with us for many, many years to come. And once something is put into place, especially with bordering techniques, it's very hard to undo it. So we really should have this discussion. We need to have a much, much broader involvement of stakeholders, various stakeholders in these kinds of changes that we are witnessing. So let me now turn to a couple of concrete examples that I want to share with you. The first one comes to us from the United States, as you can see here on the screen. And I want to tell you the story of a specific change that occurred to US immigration regulation. A procedure entitled expedited removal was introduced into law. Now, this is a very, very small provision in a very large bill which was introduced. And frankly, I think most advocates at the time never really even paid too much attention to this expedited removal provision, which actually turned out to be a great mistake for the reasons that I will describe to you momentarily. But what does this legal provision do? What does expedited removal stand for? This legal provision permits frontline officers, not only as the title says, to expeditiously return individuals who are tracked at the border. That's a traditional kind of authority that border agents would have. But what's distinctive to this particular provision, expedited removal, is the fact that not only can individuals be returned at the border, but this legal provision provides authorization for border officers to review the legal status of individuals even if they are detected up to 100 miles away from any US land and coastal border. In effect, in terms of the terminology that I'm using here, moving the border from its fixed location at the country's territorial edges into the interior. So if you look at the slide, the orange rim that you see marked on that map is the 100-mile zone. Now, this legal authorization not only relocates the border, as I've just explained to you, it also creates what has been referred to as the Constitution-like or Constitution-free zone within the United States. Again, remember that 100 miles are within the US territory already. That is a place where typically a territory where typically we would have full constitutional protections. Here, given this new provision, law enforcement agents are permitted to set up random checkups without even having to have a probable cause. And these checkups can literally take place anywhere. That is, they can take place on highways, at ferry terminals, on trains. And what the authorities are permitted to do is to ask any random person to provide proof of their legal status, of their right to remain in the United States. Now, such governmental authority and surveillance of movement of mobility, and mobility is not unheard of, right? Every time that we pass an international border, we're asked to show a passport, if we need to, a visa, provide a justification for the reason that we enter a country that is not our home country. But the distinction is that traditionally, this really would be limited to the actual moment of crossing a border. And what is distinctive here is that first temporally, this can occur after you have passed the border, and also spatially, the regulation now occurs within the interior, within the United States of America, where again, typically you would not have these kinds of mobility regulations occurring once you are within the territory of the country. Now, if stretching the border for 100 miles, if this orange rim does not impress you so much, I would actually urge you to think again. Why is that? The reason is that the most recent official data from the US, the census data, tells us that no less than 2/3 of the US population actually resides within this 100-mile zone. And another way to slice the data would be to say more than 200 million people actually reside in this malleable or movable border zone, and again are subject to all the kind of powers that I've just described to you. If you want to have even a more concrete sense of what would be covered, the bulk of the state of New York lies within this 100-mile zone. So does Florida, which is a state that has attracted many migrants for many years. And similarly, many other states would fall within the boundaries of this 100-mile zone. Not only that, the governmental authority, which is actually responsible for managing and enforcing this 100-mile zone, that is in the United States, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, has gone on record already very early on, already in early 2000s, they have gone on record declaring that from their border enforcement perspective, and they're actually not incorrect, that is, they have a statutory authorization to potentially expand expedited removal or the application of expedited removal nationwide. Now, if you were to have this discussion with me, say 5 or 3 years ago, and ask me, could expedited removal ever apply throughout the United States? That is, could the whole United States and also Honolulu, which you see down there at the bottom of the slide, ever be fully orange in this map? I would say, you know, this is a bit of a science fiction kind of scenario, partly because there are due process issues which are very significant, which at least most people in the human rights and the immigration law community thought would bar any kind of such expansion. Well, it turns out we were all wrong. In July 2019, that is month before the outbreak of the coronavirus, the Trump administration, as part of its very hard line against immigration, actually issued such a new rule authorizing a massive nationwide expansion of expedited removal, meaning that at least technically now, any person caught anywhere within the United States without authorization to be in the country may be expeditiously returned, which means that you don't actually have a judicial process. And the point that I want to emphasize here, this legal authorization is not only spatially covering the whole of the United States, it also temporally means that any person who is caught in the United States within a period of 2 years after their arrival are still potentially subject to expedited removal. This again, it's a massive expansion of the power of the government. It is still challenged before the courts. We have to see what the decision will be about whether or not this is applicable. And there are many constitutional arguments to challenge this kind of an expansive reach of expedited removal. But for the purposes of our discussion, I mentioned this, first of all, because this is a live development, that is, we still have to see what the courts will do. And secondly, because this vision of the border clearly blurs the kind of distinction that we have had in the past, which is significant in terms of rights and liberties of individuals, the distinction between the exterior and the interior. And what this new provision does is it blurs them. That is, the interior becomes similar to the exterior in the sense of potentially having individuals removed from within the territory. And as I mentioned, after a 2-year residency period, that's quite extended. All right, let's turn closer to home. So I'm going to shift to another example, which is an example that comes to us from Canada. So Canada, for its part, has really perfected the technique of interdiction abroad, effectively relocating much of Canada's immigration regulation activities to overseas gateways. These are located primarily in Europe and in Asia, where you would frequently see migration integrity officers, or sometimes they're referred to as liaison officers, who would now conduct border control activities. That is, they would inspect your passport, your visa, see if you're permitted to come to Canada. As a matter of course, outside of the country, that is before you have even embarked on your plane heading towards Canada. And in some cases, this kind of responsibility is now delegated to third parties, to private actors, especially airport and airline personnel. So if in the United States, in the previous example that I've described to you, we have seen the border bleed into the interior, here in our Canadian example, the border stretches well beyond the territorial frontiers of Canada. And this is part of a shifting border strategy that strives, and here I'm quoting from official government documentations or policy documents, which plainly and tellingly explain and tell us that the intention is to push the border out as far away as possible from the actual territorial border. So the idea, and you also see this on the screen here, is to ideally have people screened what in the technical terminology would be at the source, that is in the country of origin, before they start their journey, rather than once they arrive at the destination country. And then again and again, this, you see this in the screen, in the slide there. The idea is that at every point throughout your journey, what's referred to as the travel continuum, you will be checked. That is, you will be screened as an individual. This could occur through visa screening, airport check-in, points of embarkation, transit points, international airports, and in some cases, even once you have reached the actual territorial land border, even after you have entered Canada, you will still be monitored. So the change that we are witnessing here, the dramatic change, is that the traditional static border, the border that we started with, is now reimagined as the last point of encounter rather than the first. And you can imagine this provides a very significant buffer zone for countries to regulate mobility prior to arrival. Some of you who might have been subject to the electronic travel authorization would be familiar with this. So your information is digitally transferred to Canada long before you can even board a plane heading towards this jurisdiction. And as I read the response that we have seen to COVID, the same logic of extending the long arm of the state far away from the actual territorial border has also informed the Canadian government's response to the current global pandemic. And as some of you may recall, in mid-March, when it really became clear that the virus was not containable in any specific country or even in any specific region, that is, it really became a global pandemic, Canada responded actually very decisively and powerfully. It took unilateral action, if you recall, on March 16th, declaring a global travel ban, which came into effect 2 days later on March 18th. In fact, this ban is still with us today. And don't confuse it with the additional ban that we have, which actually was introduced on March 21st with the United States. That one was a bilateral, jointly agreed closure of the border. Again, still with us today, and we have to see what happens after June 21st. But just in the sense of our discussion here, the reason why I mentioned that this fits with the logic of the shifting border is that once Canada decided to close its border to enforce this global travel ban, it delegated to airplanes and mostly airlines abroad the task of screening people before they boarded a plane heading to Canada. And the regulation, given that there are very narrow exceptions, you have to be either a citizen or permanent resident. There are other categories that might fit under the exception, but you're not being screened once you are here in Canada. Actually, the question of whether or not you will be able to board a plane towards Canada is determined by a person who is not a government official. And of course, there are many significant implications in terms of accountability that come with that. So a classic sovereign decision of who gets in now happens in foreign transit hubs. It occurs usually is delegated, as I mentioned, to third parties, private actors, and the location can be tens, hundreds, even thousands of kilometers away from the actual Canadian border. I don't actually know if you know, but immediate family members of citizens and permanent residents of Canada who have an essential reason to travel. So this is, again, one of the narrow exceptions, people who are permitted to travel, even now. Still, according to the current regulations that we have, if someone shows any symptoms, any COVID-19 symptoms, airline personnel are instructed, not just permitted, are instructed not to allow that person to travel to Canada. So just to give you a sense of how powerful and significant the shifting border is. And as I said, we can have a discussion later on about concerns about accountability, transparency, risk of bias that comes with this kind of delegation of responsibility. Just in the interest of time, I want us to move to another example. And this third and final example, which is from the book, before I turn to discuss with you some of the development of the COVID-related advancement that we have seen. This example that I will share with you comes to us from Australia. So Australia, if you look at the image on the screen, even more explicitly than Canada and the United States, has officially relocated its border through the words of law, creating, as its government readily admits, a distinction between the country's migration zone. Those are these yellow zones or bubbles that you see on the map, and Australia as we would typically be familiar with it. And this change of law occurred in 2001. It's referred to as the excision policy in Australia. It was a change that occurred through primary legislation. So the Migration Amendment Act in 2001, later the excision zone was expanded. That happened in 2005, and then again in 2013. And this legislation, this piece of legislation authorizes Australia's immigration officials to remove asylum seekers who have managed to reach its now exceeds territory. So any boat that has arrived without authorization to any of these yellow zones that you see in the map could be treated as if these individuals, these migrants, these asylum seekers have never actually arrived to Australia, although we know that physically they actually landed on its shores. So clearly this is a legal fiction, but it's a very significant legal fiction. Why is it so significant? This excision zone, this legal fiction limits the kind of procedural and substantive protections that asylum seekers and other irregular migrants would have had, the rights that they would have been entitled to under both domestic and international law. And if we were to take this to another arena, say if we were talking about Europe, you would also have a regional set of provisions. Here it's mostly domestic and international law. And another thing which this excision zone puts into place is it eliminates the possibility of judicial review. So not only redrawing the territorial border, but also attenuating legality in the process of change. So again, these are very significant changes, very dramatic implications for the individuals impacted by the shifting border. And just to give you a full update, the slide that I have here reflects the 2005 legal changes. In 2013, the excision zone was further expanded, again through legislation, to include the entire Australian mainland. So in effect, this means that the border now applies literally anywhere and everywhere, and in some ways nowhere for the people who are not affected by these kinds of provisions at the same time. So if I had an updated map, if I wanted now to just change it, I would have to just draw everything in the bright yellow, because this is now the excision zone applies throughout the territory of Australia. And just two more words about Australia, because it is such a striking example. In addition to changing the definition of the migration zone, that is the excision zone that I've just described to you, Australia also now is involved in what is referred to as offshore processing, which in practice means that those individuals who actually reached Australia, but because of the excision zone, we're imagining that they never reached Australia. So if they are there, something has to be done with them. But because Australia does not recognize their arrival, they are now transferred offshore to very remote locations. I have here on the right-hand side on the bottom, the example of Nauru, which is a tiny Pacific island. It's 4,500 kilometers away from Australia. And this is where asylum seekers now would be placed. They may remain in these locations, in effect, in detention for years while their asylum claim is being processed and assessed. And the final provision which Australia did, again in 2013, they added another policy component which says that anyone who tries to reach its border by boat without authorization will never be settled in Australia. So this is the no way out that you see up there on the screen. It's part of a campaign that Australia has engaged in order to deter individuals, both irregular migrants trying to reach Australia, but also trying to deter the human smugglers that typically bring them in, by changing the law and suggesting that even if one's asylum claim is proved legitimate, that is, even if someone has a founded claim to remain as a refugee in Australia, because they have arrived to the excision zone, they will never, ever be able to settle in Australia. So it's like a black hole, or if you want, an original sin that cannot be overcome. So really, this is quite a dramatic kind of example that we have seen. And recall, all of the countries that I've described to you self-proclaimed to be leaders in terms of human rights, constitutional rights. These are law-abiding countries. These are rule of law societies. They have not given up on their obligations. They're just skirting the line. They're trying to find a way to publicly remain committed to their obligations, but de facto, through these shifting border techniques, are trying to evade and skirt some of these responsibilities. Again, a point that we can return to later on in the Q&A. Just the last part of my talk, I want to now move to the question of how the governmental responses that we have seen to COVID might build on the shifting border paradigm that I have just described to you. And here I just want to share with you, again, some initial thoughts. Obviously, this is a very quick moving kind of scenario that we are exploring on the go. So the one distinctive feature that we can already state confidently is that the immediate response of states, and again, this is mostly from mid-March onward, although some countries have also acted prior to that, was countries have engaged in self-closure, self-isolation, but not individually, but nationally. That is, they have closed their borders either fully or partially. And currently we have more than 200 countries subject or self-imposing these travel bans. This is absolutely unprecedented. And what countries have done is they've either banned inbound travel or outbound travel. And in fact, most countries have done both. And at the height of the crisis, the data that we currently have, the most current data, is that over 90% of the global population actually resided in countries that had introduced either these full or partial travel restrictions in response to COVID-19. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is unprecedented. I don't say this as a negative or positive comment. I just say descriptively as a matter of fact. I think some historians of epidemics and pandemics would actually tell us that this is not necessarily a development that should be in any way criticized, in part because what it means is that all these countries, given the kind of information that we have about the virus and the question of connectivity, the fact that it's key to transmission, imposing these barriers is seen as a way to break the chain. It's seen as a way to flatten the curve. And to some extent, the fact that all countries have done this means that all countries have given priority to saving life, at least at the height of the epidemic. So you can say this is actually a measure of treating each person as potentially an equal and as a democratic measure. So we will have to see. Historians will have to reflect back and tell us whether or not this was the story. Now, of course, we know that COVID was initially presented as the great equalizer. Unfortunately, we know it's also an unequalizer. That is, gender, race, socioeconomic status, health, are all significant factors in the sense of how this particular pandemic and the responses to it and individuals' exposure to the virus is clearly unequal. So we can return to that as well. But for the purposes of our discussion, the reason why I want to mention these travel bans is the question of how were they done? That is, how can all the countries of the world all of a sudden decide that travel is restricted? All of these changes were done through legal mandated changes, either emergency powers or specific regulations that countries introduced. But most significant for our discussion, none of these changes required even one battalion of soldiers to move to the edge of the territory. Not a single sack of cement had to be placed at the border. So this is very different from the Berlin Wall or the Wall of China that we discussed earlier on. Instead, what governments did is they really built on the logic of the shifting border. We know that they already know how to regulate mobility from afar, and they just drew on these techniques of regulating mobility from afar, meaning that individuals were stopped prior to arrival. They were screened in terms of their health and in terms of their legal status to see whether or not they may travel to the country which they were seeking to enter. And also, and this is really actually quite significant in terms of the potential changes that we will see, individuals now are also tracked post arrival. Now, we know that with some asylum seekers that has happened in the past. For sure, among European countries, there's a very careful tracking of individuals even once they are in the country, so long as their asylum claim is pending, which could actually take years. But here, this new set of regulation is global. That is, it applies to anyone who enters the country. And if you want to have a concrete example, Hong Kong, for example, now requires all arriving travelers, including citizens and permanent residents, to wear a GPS wristband, and that is connected to a smartphone, and it monitors their movement post-arrival to ensure that they are following the quarantine, the 14-day mandatory quarantine. And in effect, when you actually get this wristband placed on your wrist, you have to, when you arrive to your place where you're going to be quarantined, it could be your home, it could be a hotel, you actually have to walk around it. So this is calibrated with the GPS, and basically a digital fence is erected around each person. So you have your own private border following you. That is, if you breach that, if you move beyond that digital fence, you will be alerted. If you really breach it, you will be subject to a fine. So this is real, immediate, and already occurring in the world around us. Now, experts in the travel industry have been very curious to try and speculate about what the future might hold. And they're suggesting that perhaps these post-travel quarantine are very cumbersome. If you just have to come for a short visit, you will not actually travel if you have to be quarantined for 14 days. So instead, they are suggesting that individuals might be pre-quarantined. That is, they might take the 14 days of separating themselves from others prior to travel. Again, just showing us the kind of temporal and spatial stretchability, flexibility of the shifting border. All right, so we have about 7 more minutes. So I'm just going to try and here speculate about what the future might hold for international mobility. And this is really purely speculative. And I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm just going to share with you my thoughts. And I will look at past trends in order to try and inform what might be the future trends, especially now as countries are contemplating how to reopen not just their economies, but also international mobility and travel. So I'll give you a few examples from concrete cases that we are already witnessing. So one example comes to us from Israel's Ben Gurion Airport. This is an airport that has very strict security protocols, even under normal circumstances, that is non-pandemic circumstances. And that particular airport is now in the process of developing what is referred to as a seamless check-in. What does that mean? There would be no human interaction. That is, borders will be purely biometric in this particular vision. There would be little robotic cleaners that would travel around all surfaces in the terminal building and swipe and clean them throughout, in addition to having your fever check, which now occurs actually regularly. This is also, we've seen this in other countries as well. That particular airport is trying to create a platform that will permit determining in real time whether or not individuals have been tested for the virus. And the goal here, and this is seems to be the new emerging protocol for airports, is to create what is referred to as a corona-free virus transportation hub. So let's see if that occurs or not, but that's one direction. Another narrative that I want to tell you comes up to us from Vienna Airport. They have taken actually a further step. They have already reopened. This is already implemented. So Vienna Airport now requires incoming passengers to present a medical certificate that confirms their negative COVID-19 test results. If you don't have such test results, you're permitted to take the test on location at the airport. You have to pay for it privately. It's about 190 euros, which is expensive. This is per person. It's around $300 Canadian. You would have to wait for a couple of hours, and then you will receive the results. If you test positive, you have to immediately, you're shuffled to a public health authority, and of course you would have to quarantine for 14 days. If your result is negative, then the quarantine is waived, and you can just continue with your life entering Austria. Should you wish to travel onward, you would use the certificate that you have. Some airlines actually are going to require such certificates, at least that's their prediction, and you can move onward to another destination country. That particular test holds valid for 4 days. So if you need to travel thereafter, you would not have to take another test in your final destination. Again, the same idea, COVID-19 free mobility zones where international travel will occur. Now, of course, even just based on the description that I have given to you, it's clear that not everyone will be able to travel. That is, only the healthy will be permitted to move along these sealed off corridors, international corridors. So as I mentioned earlier, COVID is not the great equalizer. We are seeing these very harsh distinctions being drawn. And that's what I mentioned earlier on. If we have these protocols and it's going to be difficult to remove them, we need to have a discussion before this is put into place. And things are moving so quickly that it's actually quite difficult to have this kind of an informed discussion. And many people in the faculty are actually thinking about these issues. So, you could take amazing courses. This is for the new students, should you wish to. Many of my colleagues are thinking about these issues. Sophia Moreau, Audrey Macklin, Petra Molnar, Lisa Austin, lots of people are really thinking about these issues, and these would be fascinating topics to explore, and they're not going to go away. All right, the last example that I want to tell you, which is again from the pre-pandemic world, and then we'll turn to the Q&A, is the following. A good number of governments, even before the pandemic took hold, have been exploring the idea of having individuals travel without any travel documents. That is, just moving to a world where biometric borders would become the standard. Now, this is quite significant because our body then becomes our ticket of our admission, or our body becomes the marker of our denial of entry. And these developments, again, have started prior to the pandemic. There's a good reason to assume that they will continue in full force thereafter. So just to give you one example, and then I'll close and we'll move to the Q&A. Dubai International Airport, it's a very futuristic airport, has already introduced in its Terminal 3 a pilot program of biometric borders, which are known as smart tunnels. So if you look at the image here, this is an image of that smart tunnel. Now, it's a tunnel that you just walk through it. You don't have to show any documentation. You just walk through it. There are 80 cameras which are embedded in those walls around you as you walk. This is significant because your eye, and some of it is here, you have an image of a city, but oftentimes they would have an aquarium, so you would have different fish moving around. Your eye naturally gets drawn to it, and when you look at these images, it's helpful for the iris scan and facial recognition. So again, currently this is volitional. You have to give your permission to do so, but once the technology is there, you might well imagine that it will become more prevalent, and we will see it in various places, and it might eventually become a mandatory standard rather than just a volitional choice. There are many other futuristic and really quite unnerving examples that I could report to you. One thing that I will mention, if Raquel permits me just one more minute, and then we'll go to the Q&A, is we know that in Europe, because of their concern about asylum seekers entering without permission, they are now developing highly sophisticated, high-tech AI avatars, which are also double up as lie detectors, which calculate the risk factor for an individual. And once you have that risk factor, it attaches to you every time you cross a border. It may lead either to your ability to cross, or it may block your entry, or it may lead you to go through further screening. And the reason that this is important, the way in which these avatars work, is they look for what are referred to as micro gesture. These are subtle nonverbal facial and bodily cues that none of us can control. So again, just to give you a flavor of this future, it is somewhat dystopian. And just to leave you with my final thought here, and then I would welcome your Q&A, your questions. I started by saying that the shifting border is a new version of the border. So clearly borders are not vanishing. So the prediction that people have had in 1989 is just, we can say, I think with some confidence, has not dished out. But what we're seeing instead is borders that are transforming. So they're not vanishing, they're changing, they're transforming, they're multiplying. And the shifting border, especially in particular, is multidirectional, it's slippery, but again, not in that transnational, open, tolerant variant of the demise of the state or post-Westphalian theories that were predicted earlier on. Instead, what we're witnessing is a darker, a more restrictive orientation that has emerged. And far from the dream of a borderless world that emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall, today, not only do we find border walls built around the world, especially on global fault lines, but also the rapid proliferation of the kind of movable legal barriers that can be applied selectively, unevenly, with fluctuating degree, intensity, and frequency of regulation. So no longer a static border, that is, we're not in that old Westphalian world. The border has become a mobile and agile, sophisticated and ever-transforming legal construct, a shifting border. And this shifting border can be planted and replanted in different locations with dramatic implications for the rights and protections of everyone. And literally, this is now everyone, which falls under its remit. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, and we can have a broader conversation, hopefully once we are back in the faculty, and continue with this discussion for many years to come.
Awesome. Thank you, Ayelet. It's Raquel here from the Advancement Office. So I just encourage participants to use the Q&A button at the bottom and ask some questions, and we'll answer as many as we can. So the first question is, do you think addressing the shifting border paradigm requires a legal debate on international obligations and how this paradigm is providing for evasive strategies, or an ethical debate on much more complicated issues that are preventing the redefinition of international obligations to be more compassionate?
Oh, this is a great question. Thank you. I think we need both the legal debate and the ethical debate. And in fact, you're preempting me, because the book, as I described to you, the Shifting Border book, just starts, actually what I've described to you is really just the first 1/3 of that book. So it's really the description of these changes and providing some examples, but I devote the bulk of the book, or the second half of that book, to exploring precisely these questions. What kind of responses can we imagine, ethical and legal responses, that would actually address this new powerful way of thinking about borders? And as I mentioned, I think that states are intentionally trying to create these new zones of regulation, which are gray zones. They're very hard to regulate in some cases because you have private actors rather than state actors. In some cases because you have so many intermediate actors that it's very hard to know where jurisdiction lies, where accountability lies, where responsibility lies. So I would absolutely urge us. I think we should have a very broad discussion. I think there are some concrete ways to respond to that. I think if you want to have some concrete directions, which were already addressed, at least at the supranational level, the European Court of Human Rights has really been pushing this envelope. They have done this, I should say, earlier on, so we don't really know what's going to happen in the next few years, but certainly they held the position that you cannot have, for example, pushbacks on the high sea. So even though the removal of asylum seekers could occur, or irregular migrants could occur prior to arrival to the territory, that was still held to fall under the jurisdiction of the European Convention on Human Rights. So that's one example where you can actually use supranational and potentially international law to expand responsibilities and to counter the move that states are doing, because as I said, they're trying to evade responsibility. But I also think that there is an opening, given that most of these countries, at least formally, stand behind their obligations. So we need to call them to account to say that it's impossible to state one thing and do the other. So I hope that gives you a sense of the direction in which I would address the kind of issues, very important issues that you raised.
Great. Next question is, what comments can you offer regarding the impact upon privacy these new border issues raise?
Okay, another very complicated question, because I have said nothing about the kind of intra-country tracking that we are witnessing, right? You know that certain countries, not Canada, but certain countries have created these very invasive apps which follow you for the causes, the argument is from necessity, saying we need to have these tracing lists so we can use your smartphone to do so. And there are very significant questions about privacy, about data protection that we need to have a discussion about. I think it would really matter. And again, you can look at some of the international discussions that are now starting to occur. That is, it's one thing if you actually sign up voluntarily to an app which permits you to know whether you have come into contact with anyone who tests positive for COVID-19. And if the data is stored on your phone, it's very different than if that data is transferred to a central authority. The question of whether or not this data will be erased, or whether or not a whole digital profile can be created for each individual. Again, if the latter is the kind of future that we'll see, it's very dystopian, and I think we should be deeply worried. But again, this is a discussion that we need to have, and really, I can't overemphasize how urgent it is. We need to have it now, because we don't want these new changes to occur, and to some extent they might occur as an exception, but we know it's very, very hard to remove these exceptions once they are introduced. I want to mention that even the European countries, which typically have a stricter data protection set of regulations in comparison to North America, even they were willing to waive some of these mandatory requirements. So I think this is a very live issue. And given that we don't yet have a vaccine, and we don't necessarily know when one will be introduced, this again is a debate that will remain with us. And the more people return to work, the more the economy is reopened, the greater the pressure will be to actually create these kind of tracing lists and these kinds of various monitoring issues. So again, a live debate, very significant. You know, if you're a law student, address these, you know, enroll in this various classes that address this. If you're a practitioner, obviously we need your voice, and we need you hopefully to be involved in these debates.
Wonderful. Okay, the next question is, she just thanks you for this insightful and comprehensive review of the shifting borders. She wonders, and I wonder whether you might be able to speculate on more positive visions of the future of the arbitrarily barred and the globally discriminated. How might we advocate for the reversal of this dark trend? How might we better ensure a global system that respects rights and freedoms?
Okay, wow, okay, thank you all for these quite fantastic questions. I think I've described the perspective of states and their motivation and the kind of actions that they have taken. I have to say there are also lots of responses to this, for sure. There's a very active international human rights community that is well aware of these developments. That's you know, people are filing lawsuits, people are writing up reports, people are trying to envision a different future. I think one component, at least if we're talking about asylum seekers, so this is a narrower discussion than the general discussion about mobility across the world, which, and we need, there are two different discussions that we need to have. But if we're talking about asylum seekers and refugees, I think the emerging consensus, and I share it, is to say we really need to have a much more robust international regime of cooperation. And I'll give you an example to explain what I have in mind. We know that in Europe, for example, the coastal countries, the countries that are on the external border of Europe, Greece, Italy, Malta, and a few others, Spain, Portugal, all of these countries have felt the pressure in the sense that when refugees arrive or asylum seekers arrive to Europe, they would typically arrive to those entry gates. And given the current system, even in Europe, which has the most advanced supranational system of asylum protection, the processing occurs at the country which you have reached. And that places a tremendous responsibility and also a tremendous burden on these countries. So one way to address this is to say, well, if Europe is Europe, then definitely you would want to have a regime of some degree of relocation. That is, if individuals are held to actually have a legitimate claim, and many, many do, then you would need to say other countries within Europe would have to either process the claim or for sure resettle individuals should they remain in the continent. And we can imagine a global regime that would have the same kind of responsibility sharing. We're currently far away from that, but as a direction, I think it's a very clear direction, and one which, again, we can imagine it occurring. We know that we had the global compact. So there are counter narratives which are very significant, partly civil society, but partly also legal debates about these issues. And I think that we actually know what the way is forward. The question that we have is how to get the political will, how to actually move from here to there. And that's a very difficult challenge in and of itself. But I think we have the ideas out there. People have looked at effective control as a way to expand the notion of jurisdiction. So there are many responsibility by proxy. There are many legal tools and actually great ideas of how to address these issues, but we're still, the problem that we have is the problem of getting the motivation of getting enough countries on board.
Wonderful. Okay, so this will just be the last question. So it just pertains to the accountability and the infringement of human rights. And they just asked to specifically elaborate on when there's no tangible Canadian border as it's extended to other countries. What are the implications of that?
Okay, this is a long question, and I think we have about 2 minutes. So hopefully we can meet in person or have another way to have this discussion. But yeah, this is a very serious concern, in part because of questions of extraterritoriality, and which in Canada are particularly complicated in terms of constitutional obligations. But generally, the more intermediate actors that you have, as I mentioned earlier, the more difficult it is to actually create the legal link that you would need to have. So if an asylum seeker is stopped prior to arriving to Canada, prior to having what is referred to as territorial arrival, that is, if they have not reached our border, then the kind of protections that individuals have are much, they're fewer, they're narrower, they're harder to activate. So in the book, one of the suggestions that I have, and I think this is just by virtue of consistency, countries cannot, on the one hand, extend the border and really have it operate potentially anywhere in the world. That is, if you're exercising authority, according to our classic rule of law thinking, then responsibility attaches to that exercise of authority. It should not be spatially grounded. It is actually related to the action and the actor. And if the action comes from either is done by an official of the state or the authorization to act came from a government, either official or a regulation, then in my reading, our basic rule of law principles actually require us to also have responsibility follow that exercise of authority. But in order to really have a full discussion about this, and this is where the book is couched in the sense of a broader discussion, and if you want to read a little bit more about that, myself and Professor Ron Hirschel have published a piece that's entitled Spatial Statism. It was published in the International Journal of Constitutional Law. And there we really say that partly the discussion that we need to have is we need to rethink the relationship between law and spatiality, because so much of our Westphalian conception of sovereignty is territorial. And to a great extent, what countries are doing is they have managed to find in some ways a brilliant way to move beyond the territory. So if the exercise of authority as an exercise of public law occurs outside the territory. As I said, I believe very strongly that's responsibility should follow. Now that's a principle. How do we translate that back to the actual world of legal practice is a difficult question. But as I said, again, I don't think we're lacking ideas. And I think this is a very clean and principled response to say you cannot just use power without responsibility. As I said, that's our most basic principle of public law, is that the states need to be held to account, especially when they are using the most significant, one of the most significant sovereign powers that they have. That is the decision determining who should get in and who should be blocked out. So, you know, I think we have a tremendous amount of resources, but we definitely need to do a lot of translation work from the large mega principles that we have to the actual concrete implementation. So I hope it gives you a taste of the direction which I take. And again, you can read this in the book, in various other publications that I have written. And as I said, hopefully at some point we will be able to have a broader discussion in person.
Awesome. And I'm just going to close quickly. So thank you so much, Professor Shachar, for this informative and thoughtful presentation. And I just want to thank all of the faculties of Law's alumni, students, and friends for participating today. And just note that I'll be sending a follow-up email with the slides, the webinar recording, and a link to the Shifting Borders book in the next few days. And I just want to thank everyone again and hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.